starting סימן Kuf Chavav, which, as we're going to say of the din of גיטין. After we learned the previous סימן, the din that have to do with the writing, Mokav Gvil, Negias, all those things, holes in the get, etc. We're moving on to the actual writing of the get, the Nusach get, the writing of the get, which script to use, which language to use, and all the various ways how to write dates and how to write places and everything else that is connected to that. It starts with from Sif Beis and onwards. It's a big chunk of how to write the days, etc. Things that we already learned in the past. Those things, or a lot of things that are in this סימן are things that were not learned in the past. Last year when we learned these nekudas regarding Aksuba, and therefore we're going to go through it now. The Gemara says that a get which was written in Lashon Kodesh and the Eidim signed it in Aramaic, in Greek, or the other way around, is kosher. And that applies to every single language. The Rashba writes that even though you could be medayik from a Tosefta that it is possible, still if it's written only in one language, the whole get is written in one language, it's kosher. And lechatchila, it's kosher in any script, in any language. The Rosh says that the minhag is ready to write in Ksav Aשוry, which means like a Sefer Torah, but without the tagim, only with the koitzim, which is the tagim is the crowns, the koitzim is the edges in the letters, like you have on top of the yud, you have on the bottom of the yud. There's a discussion of the back of the base also has to have a koitz, etc. And it has to be written in Lashon Aramis. That is, the Rosh says that is l'chatchila how it's done. That's the minhag. And if not, in Ashkenaz, in Germany, they're already paisel unless it's a mokim igun, that it comes from a faraway place and there's no shayolas mitzuyas, etc. And you can't get another get. This is all from the Beis Yosef. But Trumas Hadeshin says in the name of the Zerua that you write it a thick letters, not thin letters. That means there is a way to write whoever did Safras knows you could. Today with pens it's not like that, but when you have a kulmus, you could either write with the edge of the kulmus, a half of the kulmus, or you could put the whole kulmus down, and then you write it. So. See, a thick one, the way Sefer Torah is written, the way Safras is written, is thick letters. It means the kulmus is put all the way down, and then you draw the letter. And that's how the translation says you should write it. And even a koitzer shel yud is ma'akev, and the Rambam says that means that you just don't write it in a very thin way. That means, like I just explained to you, that basically put the whole kulmus down. Even though the the lashon of the Zerua is that it should be done ksiva gasav, a thick one, for the purpose of it should be ksiva tama. We already know that ksiva tama is not a requirement for a get, and the Rambam says basically just means to imply that it should not be a thin lines. It should not be like when you write with a pen. Rather, it should be the thicker ones. The Beis Yosef brings that there are those who are paisel to write a get in Ksav Provincial, which is what we know today as Rashi letters. What? Huh? The Beis Yosef brings, some people are, it's a big machlokes. Why? Because Ksav Rashi, what we call Rashi letters, is not similar b'chlal to Ksav Aשוry. It's not square. And the Beis Yosef on that says he doesn't understand the svara for it. Being that is used for writing books and for writing shtaris, it's no worse than writing a get in English letters or in other language letters. Yeah, but if it's L'chatchila, we're talking about from the Gemara, it's mashma you could write in any lashon.
He said that only Mahimim, the Rosh says only Mahimim.
Only what? Mokim Igun, that's how they do it. But the question is, that's about if it's written in a Question is if it means only if it's written in a different language, or also if it's written also in a ksav that's not mamash Aשוry. The Beis Yosef disagrees with the Rosh, obviously. Yeah, these people disagree with the Rosh. So he says that really if you have a handwriting, if you have a ksav which is square, that's when it has to be written like ksav Aשוry. That means, but if you're writing something like ksav Rashi, it's fine because it's its own independent ksav and it's clearly read and understood. And the Beis Yosef says, Lamaisa, being that the Rosh is machmir, and any place that's not ksav Aשוry unless it's a mokem igun, toiv lachush to the Rosh. There's another interesting point that the Beis Yosef over here says, and this is a machlokes which is going to come across later, that if you have a different ksav, if you're able to write, if you have a sefer that writes in ksav Aשוry, but it's not the perfect ksav Aשוry, and somebody else writes in the perfect ksav Rashi, yeah, or someone writes in the ksav which is square but not ksav Aשוry, it's mashma from the Tzumas from the Zerua, that may be better to write in that ksav, that the not so clear Aשוry, the square one, the Beis Yosef says punkt fakert. It's better to write with a ksav that is not so, they're better to write with a Rashi ksav that's clear and the letters are defined rather than writing with a square letters that are not ksav Aשוry. The Mechaber, when he writes in the Mechaber, this is all pretty much what he writes in the Beis Yosef. When he writes in the Mechaber starts by saying, L'chatchila, he says, you could write the get in any language and in any script, whether it's a language of Yidden, whether it's a language of Goyim, but if it's partially written in one language and partially written in another language, it's possible. The Ramah says, V'yesh machshirim, and that is the Ravid. The Ramah then continues and says that even those who are poisel, two separate languages, it's when it comes to a regular get today has words in Aramaic and words in Lashon Kodesh. The date is written in Hebrew. The city is written, Mosa is in Aramaic, the Yasva. Then you have the Nusach of the get. Varet Metes Chol Adam is in Lashon Kodesh. Then it goes back to Aramaic, get Pturim, get a Shukin. And then you have the end, Kedas Moshe Yisrael back to Lashon Kodesh. So it jumps back and forth. The Ramah gives three reasons why it's not a problem. Three terutzim, and everybody goes at him. This is summarizing an argument that he had with Mahari Padva. It's in the Chuvas of the Ramah. It's a whole back and forth regarding this topic, but the Ramah summarizes the three reasons that he wrote in his Chuvas why it's not considered writing in two languages. What are the three reasons that Ramah gives? First of all is Lashon Kodesh and Targum were given both in Har Sinai and they're similar to each other. So it's not considered like two separate languages. Since the majority is in Aramaic, and only part of it is in Lashon Kodesh, so it's not miktsasei, but it's ruboy miktsasei, and therefore it's kosher. It's a second teretz. And the third one is that only if the toiref is only by the toiref, the ikar toiref, the main part of the toiref, is if you write it in two separate languages, then you have a problem. It means you jump back and forth in the specific lashonis. But varet meteres chol adam is not ik, even though it's the toiref, it's ikar shall get, but it's not the toiref which is crucial for the get, because the lashonis hareat meteres chol adam is already understood from the rest of the get. So therefore, that part is not considered. Therefore, the third teretz is that it depends if it's the toiref, or if it's the actual toiref, or the secondary toiref. The toifus. Huh? Pretty much, except for the date. Well, the date, I don't know if there is a way to do it. We're soon going to get to where everybody disagrees with these answers. The Mechaber anyways concludes and says, Lamaisa, the minig is to write it ksav Ashuris and write it in Aramaic. And the Ramah then adds over there that you shouldn't be machshirit if it's written in a different language. in a different ksav, not different, in a different ksav, unless semokim igun and she'as hatchak. Now, let's go, there's a bunch of different discussions that come across over here. The Mechaber writes Miksasi in one language and Miksasi in a different language. It's possible. Yeah, that the Ramah says Yesh Machshirim, we're going to get to soon the Ramah, everybody disagrees on the Ramah on that, everybody except for the Gra. But the Chelkas Mechoykik over here points out that if it's two different kinds of handwritings, it's kosher. And the Beis Shmuel says, but the Lavush says that two different kinds of handwriting is possible. The Chelkas Mechoykik says that it's kosher. If it's Chsimas Ha'edim, if one aid signs in Hebrew and one aid signs in Greece, the Beis Shmuel, in Greek or in English, the Beis Shmuel brings from Siman Kuf Lamed, it's mashma, it's not a problem, because every signature is considered its own inyan. That means signature 1 is one inyan, signature 2 is another inyan. So if one writes signature in Lashon Kodesh, he did the full one inyan in one language. Second one wrote it in English, he wrote a full one inyan in one language. So it's good. So we can see the get pashas and medayik from it, that if you switch languages in the middle of a signature, then it doesn't work. Now, the Ramah says that if it's Miktasi b'loshen Miktasi b'loshen acher, he says Yesh Machshirim, which is the Ravid. The Chelkas Mechoykik right away says, and this.
It's like a new star.
What?
It's like a new
Inyan, yeah. A new star. It's its own star.
Huh?
Essentially, its own star, yeah. The Chelkas Mechoykik says the Ravid was never machshir such a thing. The Ravid brings it as a svara, b'derech hefsher. Therefore, he says, I don't know why the Ramah says Yesh Machshirim. And the same thing is also in the Get Pashut. I think the Pri Chodesh also disagrees with it. The only person who follows the Ramah is the Gra, who writes V'chei nira li on this. Goes into discussion and there is V'chei nira li. The Pri Chodesh over here says that when it comes to the Toifus, even the Chatchila you could write in two different languages. Only by the Toifus you have to be machmer. Now, we mentioned that the Ramah gives three reasons why by a get, if it's by a get you have a mixture of Lashon Kodesh and Aramaic. The Taz goes through all three reasons, says none of the reasons are valid. Knocks them all off. And he says a different reason. He says the reason is not because of that. The reason is because Aramaic, the Lashon of the Gemaras is Aramaic mixed with Lashon Kodesh. So it all became one language. It's not two languages. It is one language. And therefore, what does it mean that you write in two languages? When would it be possible a mixture of Aramaic and Lashon Kodesh? Is when the words that you're using is a Lashon Kodesh word that in Aramaic it has a word in Aramaic which is commonly used in Aramaic, and you decided to switch that word for Lashon Kodesh. Right? The whole get is really Aramaic. Then you're going to soon see there's a get pashut says that today you should do faket. Today nobody talks Aramaic, so maybe you should look at faket. It should be possible. We're going to get to it soon. There are common words for it in Aramaic, but it's again that we might say it's not part of the Toifus, which he doesn't like. He doesn't like that thing. But he says it's something which is used in the lashon of the Gemara, even though it has other words. But in the Gemara, those words are used. That means it's not that it doesn't have translation, because the whole date is also Sheni, Shlishi, B'Shabbos. All these have words in Aramaic. But it means if these words are used in the Gemara, it became part of the Gemara language. It's not that we're writing a get in Aramaic. We're writing a get in Lashon HaTalmudim. That's what we're writing a get in. It's not a get written in Lashon Targum. It's not a get written in Lashon Kodesh. It's a get written in Talmudic language. Talmudic language is a combination. There's a few Persian words also in the Talmudic language. The second teretz of the Ramah is that if it's rubai in one language and miuti in a different language, it's the second teretz of the Ramah, it's still fine. No, the Pri Chada says it makes absolutely no sense. Even if you have one word in a different language, it makes the whole get puzzle. Elamai, the Pri Chada says really we only have to rely on the third one, that it depends if it's toidif or if it's toifus. And then he comes up with this concept of toidif hechrechi and toidif which is not hechrechi. Toidif which is mandatory, parts of the toidif which are me'akiv, and parts of the toidif that you have to write in the get, but they're not mandatory to understanding what the get is. Like Arayat Muteres L'chol Adam. And that he moves it into the category of toifus. So even though those things, you could write them in Aramaic, because there are words for it in Aramaic, still in all, since it's not the toidef ha'achrechi, this is his concept, then it's not aser. On what the Ramah says that you should, based on the Rosh, that you can't be machshir if it's a different ksav that's not ksav Aשוry, unless it's a mokem igun neshasat chag. The Pri Chada says alachas kam v'kama in a different language. Not like, because the Ramah originally says v'yesh machshirim in the beginning. But he says go to the end of the Ramah. When the Ramah says mokem igun neshasat chag, it's not only like the Ramah says only in ksav that's not Aשוry. Alachas kam v'kama in a language that's not Aramaic, that's not the original language. The Get Pashut has about 10 long paragraphs on this seif. It's about 4 big pages. Let's go through this interesting nekudas from each one. Even though the Pischei Tshuva only felt that it's important to bring one of them, I'll bring you a few more just you should have for your interesting. First point he says, from the simple mashmos of the Mechaber, it means we're starting before we get to what do we do l'chumra. If it's written in Lashon of Goyim and in Ksav of Goyim, it's also kosher. It means it's not that you write it like in Yiddish is written in Lashon Kodesh letters. Ladino is written in Lashon Kodesh letters sometimes. Ma'am Loya is originally printed in Lashon Kodesh letters. The Tanya in Arabic is printed in Lashon Kodesh letters because that's what the only thing they were able to read, but it's a different language. So the same way you have today transliteration to English of Hebrew things, the same.
It's also Jewish Arabic, Jewish Spanish.
Jewish Spanish, yeah. Ladino. It's its own language. It's like Yiddish. Yiddish for the Germans, and there's Ladino for the ones where they spoke Spanish, and the countries where there's mainly Arabic, Morocco, Tunisia, and those areas had a Yiddish Arabic, and it was written in Lashon Kodesh letters in Ksav Aשוry. Well, written really in Ksav Chatzikomos maybe, but not in Ksav Aשוry. He says as long as the Lashonis are clear in it, that you're divorcing her and you're poited her and everything else, even if it's written in Sai Lashon Goyim and Sai Ksiv Goyim, it's still kosher. That's in Sivkot Aleph. Sivkot Beis explains that even though when you read the Gemara, which talks about that get B'Lashon Yevani ve'edav B'Lashon be'ivri or fakert, you could imply from it that the Gemara is only matir if you write a different language, but not a different ksav, that you would have to write the English words in ksav Aשוry. He says no, it's not so. Why? He says it makes no sense. Ultimately, being that we're not makpid in a get, that the Lashon should be Lashon Kodesh, like by Sefer Torah, we're makpid, it has to be written in Lashon Kodesh. Same thing, we're not makpid that everything should be Ksav Aשוry, just like Sefer Torah. We mentioned what before the Bishmul brings from the Beis Yosef and Siman Kuf Lamed, and Chasimas is in the Eidim signature. It's not the end of the world if one Chasima is in English and one Chasima is in Hebrew. Why? Because each Chasima is his own thing. So the Get Pashut Sivkot Hey says from that's mashma that if you have the same aid would switch languages in the middle of a signature would be a problem. That means he would start writing in English, he write his first name in English, and then it's Chapzech, and he write Joseph in English, and he write Ben Yehuda in Lashon Kodesh. That would be possible. Just like a get, which is the inyan echad, if you switch around in it, it becomes possible. So too, echsime, which is the inyan echad, if you focus on the idea of inyan echad, it would be possible. And he says that's where it's mashma from the Prisha. He concludes this Sifkot and Hey by saying that what the Ramah says in the name of the Raivad Yesh Machshirim makes no sense. He goes through all the people that discuss it. He says nobody disagrees clearly with the Rambam, and there's no way to be able to say Yesh Machshirim, a get which is Tul Hashenis is possible. It means he's even stricter than the get, but the Pri Chodosh went and said, no, b'mokim igun shazat chak, we could do it. More machmer than the Ramah. But the get pashas is b'shum panim v'ayfer not.
And our gitin, he would say, how would he mashal to the gitin of the date and
That's something else. Aramaic and Lashon Kodesh will get to soon. This is a whole different parsha. We're talking about English and Lashon Kodesh, English and Aramaic. Well, yeah, one thing we didn't discuss it is why is it possible if it's in two separate languages, and why is it possible if it's in two separate handwritings? Yeah, two separate handwritings. So why is it possible in two separate languages? The get Pashat and Sifkat Vav says, very simple. He brings from the Prisha. The Torah says, because of law, Sefer Krisus. Sefer, one Sefer, not two. If you have two separate languages, it looks like two separate Sfarim. The Get Pashat says this is not a drosha, this is an asmachta, which means this is not something that a complete drosha mikra that you're going to say that it becomes a deraisa. It's only an asmachta. Therefore, the get is possible, not bottle. If it will be a drosha, it would be get to be bottle. Why is that? Because the word sefer comes from a different drosha, comes for a different drosha. It's to teach us that sefer is a sipur dvarim. Sefer is one sefer echad, as in like it should be one piece of cloth, not two of them sewed together. But this, there should be sefer echad loishnei sfarim, that it shouldn't change the language in the middle. That is a asmachta. Now, what happens if it's written in this one language, partially written, two different handwritings? So we did mention what the Chalkas Mechaykik says, that it's kosher even according to the Rambam if you write half of it in Ksav Aשוry and half of it in Ksav Rashi l'chayra. That's what's mashma. And he says the Marikash holds that it's possible, even if it's written in Ksav Aשוry and in Ksav Rashi, part and part. Lachas Kama v'Kama if it's written partially in Ksav Aשוry and partially in Ksav Nachri. V'goy. Why? Because it doesn't look like one get. It doesn't look like a get. Comes the get Pashat and says, I have a big question on it. Later on in this Siman, regarding the Aleph and the Lamed together, whoever remembers the old Sidurim, the old prince, Aleph and the Lamed became one letter. Yeah, they would just take the top right half of the Aleph and pull something out of it, and it became an Aleph and a Lamed combined. It says kosher. Frek the get Pashat, l'chayra, that's a different ksav. It's not ksav Aשוry. It's not ksav provincial. It's not ksav Rashi, but it's not ksav Aשוry. There's no such a combination letter in ksav Aשוry. So how could the mechaber be matter such a thing? If, like the Marikash says, that it's even one letter is a problem, changing it should be a problem. So he says no. Maybe the Marikash would be moed if it's one letter, or maybe just one word changes, it's not the end of the world. Or maybe if it's only in the Teufus, Kedas Moshe v'Yisrael, it's a part of the Teufus, not the Teiref, then it would be fine. Grad, if you follow this one, this answer, you have a big problem, because if a person's name is Yisrael, his first name is Yisrael, it's part of the Teiref, not part of the Teufus. But yeah. And then he says, no, really, even one letter or one word that's a different ksav completely is possible according to Marikash. The only difference is that Aleph and Lamed combined looks like part of the same font. We'll call it in modern English, part of the same style. When you look at the old Sidurim, which have that, the old Chumashim, you don't think that it's a different font. It's part of the same font. These two got combined together for whatever reason. Yeah, so then he continues and he goes into a whole different topic. That we you remember we spoke in the beginning that Beis Yosef brings us two different shittas, two ways of looking at it. The Beis Yosef holds that it's better to write Ksav Provincial, Ksav Rashi, which is clear, rather than a Ksav which is doimet, a Ksav Ashuri, but it's not Ksav Ashuri. So he says, now what happens if you have the whole get in Ksav Ashuri and one word is similar to Ksav Ashuri but not Ksav Ashuri? He says that even the Marikash would say that it's kosher. But he says that even Lachri Kol Zeh, because the Marikash wrote so sharply against it, the Get Pasha is only machshir if that would happen in the Toifas and not in the Toiref. A shinui of handwriting in even one word within a sentence would only be kosher in the Toifas, not in the Toiref. That means he takes will only be kosher in the Toifas. If it's in the Toiref, it will be possible. Not possible, he says yesh lahachmer. He says if it's written partially and partially two separate handwritings, even if it's only one word, yesh lahachmer in that. In Sifkat and Zayin, he goes through all the three answers of the Ramah. He starts with the three answers of the Ramah, says they're all invalid. And then he brings the reason of the Marikash, which we know similarly was written by the Taz, which is that the Lashon HaTalmudim, the Talmudic language, is a combination of Lashon Kodesh and Aramaic. And he says, he says you cannot bring proof from the Gemara. The Gemara is not a language. The Gemara is a combination of people, the Tanoim from Eretz HaKodesh, so obviously they spoke in Lashon Kodesh. The Amoraim in Bavel, obviously they spoke in Aramaic. So you can't bring a raya from the Gemara, which was never meant to be a dictionary, never meant to be a language book. It is a collection of writings. So you have some writings from people in Israel, so it's in Hebrew. Some writings from people in Bavel is in Aramaic. So you can't go and create now something called the Talmudic language. You can't create a Lashon Echad out of it. And he says, and Bichlal, Fakert, today, in his place, everybody speaks Lashon Kodesh. So now what they're going to look at it, they're going to look at it that it's a Lashon Kodesh get with a couple of Aramaic words mixed into it. So I originally, Taka had a good answer, maybe, that it's Aramaic mixed with Lashon Kodesh and it's all part of the same thing, Talmudic language. He says, no. Today, the Get Pashat lived in Mitzrayim and Yerushalayim, I think, and he says it's the same. It would be considered. People would look at it and say, hey, it's a Lashon Kodesh, and it switches on and off into Aramaic. So it's a Lashon Kodesh get with Aramaic mixed into it. It should be considered two languages. And he says, today we see that people here who speak Lashon Kodesh, they also mix in words from Arabic and from Turkish. He says, he was in Israel. Where was the Get Pashat? In Yerushalayim and Tzfas? I'm not sure. I think that's so. And he says they mix a few because they deal with the goyim and they mix it in. He says nobody's going to tell you that becomes part of Lashon Kodesh. The fact that the Yidden in Eretz Yisrael speak mixed with some language they brought in from Turkey or they brought in from the Arabs around doesn't make it into one language. What's enough? If you have today, the people who write, if someone would decide to write a get in Yiddish in New York, it'll be mixed with English. So a guy comes out of Alter, it'll be Yiddish like in the Kutah Sichas, it's 75% Lashon Kodesh. Is it Yiddish? Can sein. Depends if you consider that the way of talking a language or not. So he says the only valid reason is that Be'etzim Lashon Kodesh and Targum is really one language. They're one language because they're so similar one to another, like the Ramosas that were given in Har Sinai. And what's the raya? Even in Torah we find words of Aramaic, of Targum inside. You got Sadusa, Vasam Rivais Kodesh, and others. And therefore, just like in the Torah, what? Anoichi, yeah, Lashon Mitzri, yeah. So you have other words that are not, so to speak, Lashon Kodesh, and we know that the Torah has to be written Lashon Kodesh. That means that these Lashonis, Lashon Targum, is part of Lashon Kodesh. And therefore, the get it's considered one Lashon. Now, why did they specifically, now let's move to the next thing in Sivkot and Ches, he says, why did they dafka write it in Lashon Arami? He says in the time of the Gemara, when they perfected the Lashon of the get, they used the Lashon that everybody spoke about, and they perfected a Lashon that every word should explain what the get is in every possible way, and no word can have two meanings. That means every word in the get cannot be understood in two separate ways. And there's the yukim, which we're going to get to, and we're going to go through the Siman. Every word, some words, they have to be spelled in a certain way, so that way the understanding of the word cannot be misunderstood to mean something else. So therefore, even today, because we stayed with the same thing, because if we're going to start writing in a different language, you might have a word which has a separate meaning, which is not perfect. And now comes Sivkot and Yud, he brings a shaila, which is what's based on the original B'Siyosef, which we mentioned before, about Rashi versus not Rashi, versus unclear Ksav Ashuri. And this is what the Pischei Teshuva chose to bring from the Get Pashat and the Siman. Obviously, he looks at this as la halacha, that if you have a sefer who does not know how to write proper Ksav Ashuris, he only knows how to write a similar Ksav, a square Ksav, which is not Ksav Ashuri. Or he could write in Ksav Rashi, in Rashi letters. And it's a Mokamigun, it's a Shadachak, what's the way to do it? And he says, obviously, it's dependent on the machlekes that the B'Siyosef himself brings. The B'Siyosef holds that it would be better to have Rashi letters rather than Ashuri, which is not Ashuri, square, which is not Ashuri. And he says, I hold like the B'Siyosef. Why? Because if you're going to write square letters, which is not Ksav Ashuri, there are certain letters that a person might mix up a beis and a chaf. When you have kids in preschool, or someone ever have kids in preschool, and they learn how to write in square letters, and you'll see the bases and the chafs are going to get mixed up. And it could change the inyan because of it, and therefore you should not be able to do it. But in Ksav Rashi, if a person writes a good Ksav Rashi, there'll be no confusions if he'll properly write the Ksav. He says, but if the Sefer could write a Ksav Ashuri, which is just not a beautiful Ksav. Sometimes you get mezuzahs, Ksav Ashuri, Gahakta mezuzahs, the kosher. Sefer Torah also. Just the Sefer, it wasn't a perfect Sefer. So that is better than Ksav Rashi. But he says, but just writing square letters, the Ksav, which is like Ashuri, but it's not Ashuri, that's Rashi, Ksav Rashi is better. The Aruch HaShulchan takes it a step further, by the way, in Sivkot and Hey, and he says that if the Ksav Ashuri is so gehakt that it's hard to read the letters in it, and even if by Sefer Torah it would be kosher, by a get is a shaila if it's kosher or not. The Aruch HaShulchan in Siv Hey goes the other way. So sometimes you could have a Ksav and a Sefer, there's be kosher for Sefer Torah and Ashuris, and by a get it would not be, there's a suffix if it's kosher or not. Anyways, the Get Pasha concludes that when the Ramah says, he says the same thing as the Pri Chadash, when the Ramah says that you should only be that when you're machshir in a different, it's not Ksav Ashuri, but only Mokamigun and Shas Atchak, the same thing applies to writing in a different language. Now, I did tell you before, why is it that the languages and all languages and all spellings are kosher? I mentioned there's a reason for it. So, in the Beis Yosef it brings that there's a svara because you have to daven ksavim which are written not by hediyaitis or written by more professional people. There's a whole different reason, which makes a lot of sense in Sif Gimel. He says, Nispashat b'medinei Seinu, these languages and scripts became common in the countries around the world, and therefore they're all kosher. But if you're going to have a get which has two different kinds of spellings together, then it could become possible in a place where they're not going to view it as one, where it didn't become common to have this ksav kilayim. to have a mixture, a combined script. And they're not going to understand how to read it, huh?
If they understand the other scripts, then they'll understand how to read it.
Yeah, but they're going to see it's two separate ones. It didn't become into one script. Which from this comes out a very interesting chumrah. If today you're going to sit and you're going to write a get in a script which is no longer in existence, or Avar Batam in the Olam, I don't know anybody who could write Ksav Chatzikomus. I know one person maybe who could write such a thing, my cousin. That's about it. Maybe we become puzzle. Now, we say that the get is written in Aramaic. We explain the reason why the get is written in Aramaic, because that's the Lashon of the Gemara. There's an interesting Mei HaShiloyach that it's brought in the Sefer Kavitz Al Yad that you have over here in Hilchos Gitin, and he says pretty much the same reason why certain things, other things we say in Aramaic, because we don't want the Malachim to understand. He says the get, the husband is violating the Chayav Adam B'chvoid Ishtay. Ishtay is a Beisai. He's mezalzel in the covet of his wife. He says the Mekatragim are going to see that this guy, they're going to pick on him, Mekatragim. So he says, we write it in Lashon Arami, the parts that are negative, so that way, when the Mekatragim are going to see it, they're not going to understand what's flying, and they're not going to be Mekatrag on him that this guy is going against what the Eibishter says, that you have to be Mechabed, not to be mezalzel in your wife. There's a book, Kahal Yisrael on Gitin, which points out and mentions something from a Sefer, the Sefer Zikor and Aderes Eliyahu, which I think is Netzach Chacham, I wasn't able to find it, maybe I misspelled it, that there was a whole argument regarding a get which came from Bukhara to Eretz Yisrael, written in Bukharian script and Bukharian language. There's a whole back and forth between the Rabbanim over there, if you could be machshir it or not. I wasn't able to find the Sefer, so I'll look for it a different time, I'll be able to find it. But that there is such a shaila. That means, if it's written in a language that's only, in a script that's only understood in the place where the get was written, but it's going to be sent to another country where that script and that language is not common, it becomes a shaila. Today you can always find translators in almost every place to understand every language. I'm talking about years ago, it was taka shaila. By the way, the Kavnaki says that in Seder Getrish and Siman Ayin Tes Sifkat and Lamed Beis, that in today's day and age also should not write in any other script except for Aשוry, even B'Shas Chak, because who is the one who will be Machriya in other scripts of Lashon Kodesh that are Mishtane Mimokim Lemokim Mizman Lezman? That means the Ksav, the other scripts of Lashon Kodesh, the other fonts, are mishtane from generation to generation, from country to country, and therefore you're going to start writing. It doesn't go into too much details about it. But in the Hashlamas Asdarim, which is what the Kavnaki wrote afterwards, means the Kavnaki first printed the Sefer, then he printed, and then there was like a kuntras of like 4 pages of Isafas to it, and then later he printed a kuntras of Hashlamas Asdarim. That was after Tzemach Tzedek was printed, so he references all the Tzemach Tzedeks, and he sends you on this Seif, he says, but look in the Chaz of Shuvah Tzemach Tzedek, Siman Reish Pei Daled, over there, where Tzemach Tzedek was machshir, a get which was written not in Ksav Aשוry. What's the story over there? I don't have enough time, I'll just give you in short, very short in the kud of it. It was a Mokimigun. Husband disappeared for 7 years, I think, 7 years. They located him in some farvar from the Shtat, and over there was one guy who was able to write. But he was only able to write script, or whatever, like the script, Lashon Kodesh and script, not Aשוry, not square, not Rashi, nothing. Okay, you know how to write. And Tzemach Tzedek says you should write a get like that, and give it to his wife, not sign the get. This is going to discussion about it. Only give it with Eideh Mesireh. Send it with Eideh Mesireh. And then, the same time, the husband should also appoint a Sefer and an Eidem in a different place to write a get and give it to her through a Shliach, a proper get B'Chsav Aשוry. 2 Gittin. First give this one, then give the second one. That's what the Tzemach Tzedek was, the Eitzer of the Tzemach Tzedek. So it comes out interesting, if you don't have somebody to write Ksav Aשוry, yes, the Tzemach Tzedek says right away, it's kosher. The first get is kosher. But better to have a second get written. And with that, we conclude the first seif of Siman Kuf Chavav.